The moment Raymond Finch slapped Kate Beckett's wrist down on the table like she was nothing more than a poker chip, every soul in the Silver Spur saloon went quiet. It was the summer of 1882, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of the cattle trail like a wound that never fully healed. Dust lived in every crack of every building, whiskey stained the floorboards, and the air always smelled faintly of horses and gun oil. It was not a gentle place, and it had never pretended to be. But even in Caldwell, even among men who had seen violence and hunger and things that would make a preacher weep, there were lines that decent people did not cross. Raymond Finch crossed every one of them without breaking a sweat. He was a wide man with a neck like a tree stump and eyes the color of old copper, and he had spent the better part of 3 years making Kate Beckett's life a slow and grinding misery. He was not her husband. He was not her father. He was, by his own declaration, her guardian, a word he used the way a wolf might call itself a shepherd. Kate's father, Thomas Beckett, had died 14 months prior from a fever that swept through the farmstead outside of town. He had left behind a daughter, a small plot of land, and a debt to Raymond Finch that Raymond had spent every day since inflating in creative and entirely dishonest ways. Kate was 22 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with a jaw set by years of holding herself together through circumstances that would have broken lesser people. She was not a soft woman, not in the way that word sometimes meant weak, but she had a warmth in her that she kept close, the way you keep a candle lit in a storm by cupping it with both hands. She had tried to pay off her father's debt through honest work. She had mended clothes, cooked for the boarding house, helped old Mrs. Garrity run her dry goods counter. None of it ever seemed to reduce what Finch claimed she owed, because Finch kept changing the numbers and backing it up with paperwork she could not fully read and lawyers she could not afford. Tonight, he had apparently decided that the paper route was taking too long. He sat across the card table from a man Kate did not recognize, and the stranger's pile of winnings had been steadily growing for the past hour. Finch had been drinking steadily too, which was never a good sign. The other men at the table had folded out long before the stakes climbed to where they sat now, because they could see the way the current was pulling. The stranger's name was Oscar Slater. He was 30 years old, lean but solidly built the way working men are solid, all practical muscle without excess. His hair was dark brown, worn a little longer than fashionable, and he had a jaw that carried a few days of growth. His eyes were the kind of steady gray that reminded people of overcast skies before good rain, calm but full of something. He wore a plain dark coat and a hat that had clearly traveled many miles, and the only remarkable thing about his appearance was the absolute stillness with which he sat. He did not fidget. He did not crow over his winnings. He just watched his cards and then watched Finch the way a man watches a river to see if it is going to flood. Oscar had ridden into Caldwell 3 days ago. He had a background in cattle driving and had spent years on the trail between Texas and Kansas, working for ranchers, learning the land, saving money with a deliberateness that came from growing up with nothing. He had recently used those savings to purchase a modest piece of land about 12 miles northeast of Caldwell, where he intended to run cattle and build something that was actually his. He had come into town to file paperwork at the land office, restock his supplies, and had ended up at the Silver Spur because a hot meal and a quiet drink seemed like a reasonable reward after a long week. The card game had found him the way trouble finds honest men, through no particular seeking of his own. Finch had baited him into the game with exaggerated friendliness and cheap flattery, and Oscar had played along because the stakes were modest at first and he was good at cards. He did not cheat. He did not need to. He simply read people well and played the odds with patience, and over the course of the evening that patience had translated into a pile of winnings that was now making Raymond Finch sweat in a very unpleasant way. The debt marker on the table represented everything Finch had left. He had already put down cash, then his horse, then the deed to a small storage building he owned on the edge of town. And now, with the kind of desperate recklessness that only real stupidity or real panic can produce, he had reached across the table and grabbed Kate's wrist. She had been standing near the bar, waiting. Finch always made her wait nearby when he came to the saloon. He said it was to keep an eye on her. The truth was more complicated and more ugly than that, and everyone in Caldwell had long since stopped pretending they did not see it. "I am putting her in," Finch announced, his voice carrying the particular loudness of a drunk man who wants to sound confident. "Catherine Beckett. She works hard, cooks well, and she owes me more than she can ever repay on her own anyway. You win this hand, she goes with you. I lose, you hand everything back, and we call it even." The saloon went so quiet that you could hear the lanterns hissing. Kate stood perfectly still, her wrist in Finch's grip, and the expression on her face was the hardest thing Oscar Slater had ever looked at. It was not fear exactly, though fear was somewhere in it. It was something more like exhaustion mixed with a fury, so deep it had gone cold. She was looking at nothing in particular at the middle distance, because looking at the faces of the men who were watching this and doing nothing would have been more than she could bear. Oscar looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Finch. "Let go of her wrist," he said. His voice was quiet. In a loud room it would have been hard to hear. In the dead silence of the silver spur it landed like a stone dropped in still water. Finch blinked. "This is a card game, friend. You want to play or fold." "I want you to let go of her wrist," Oscar said again, with exactly the same tone and volume. "And then I want you to explain to me how a person is a gambling stake. She owes me a debt." "Debt's a debt." Finch leaned forward. "You going to play or not? Because if you're scared of the stakes—" "I am not scared of anything you have to offer," Oscar said. He reached across the table and picked up the debt marker that Finch had placed there. It was a piece of paper handwritten, with Kate's name on it and a number below it and Finch's signature at the bottom. Oscar looked at it for a moment. Then he tore it in half. Then he tore the halves into quarters. He set the pieces down on the table in front of Finch and said with absolute clarity, "She owes nobody here. Not you, not anyone at this table, not anyone in this room. Whatever your arrangement was with her father, it died with him." The silence stretched like taffy. Finch's face went through several colors. "You have got no right. I have got a hand of cards that beats whatever you are holding," Oscar said, "and I have got a considerable pile of your money and your property already in front of me. But more importantly than any of that, I have got two working eyes and I can see what this is." He stood up slowly, unhurried, the way a man stands up when he is absolutely certain he is not sitting back down. "Game is over." Finch looked around the room, clearly hoping someone would back him up. The bartender was looking at the ceiling. The other card players had found their boot tops extremely interesting. The few other patrons had discovered urgent business near the door. "You will regret this," Finch said. "It came out smaller than he intended." "I doubt it." Oscar walked around the table. He stopped next to Kate and, without touching her, simply stood beside her. "Are you all right, miss?" Kate Beckett looked at him for a long moment. Her dark eyes were difficult to read, full of something complicated that she had not yet decided what to do with. "I am fine," she said, and her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "Good." He nodded once. "I am Oscar Slater. I have a room at the boarding house on Meridian Street if you need somewhere safe to be tonight." "I have my own place," she said a little sharply. "I know you do," he said without any offense. "I am just saying the offer is there." He turned back toward the bar, collected his coat from the stool where he had left it, and dropped enough coins to cover his own drinks plus a generous tip on the counter. Then he walked out of the Silver Spur and into the warm Kansas night, and the door swung shut behind him. For a moment everyone breathed. Then Kate picked up the torn pieces of the debt marker from the table. She looked at them in her hand. Then she looked at Finch, who had gone a gray color and seemed to have lost several inches of height. "Raymond," she said quietly, "do not come to my door again." She put the torn paper in her apron pocket and walked out. The night air hit her like a breath she had been holding for 14 months. She stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon for a moment, letting the prairie wind move through her hair, looking up at the sky, which was enormous and indifferent and full of stars. In the distance, some cattle were lowing. A dog barked twice and fell silent. Caldwell smelled like it always did, of dust and hay and the particular sharpness of a working town that never quite rested. Oscar Slater was about 20 yards down the boardwalk, leaning against a post and looking out at the street. He did not look like he was waiting for her. He looked like a man who was simply standing in a place because he had not yet decided to walk somewhere else. There is a particular art to not being pushy, and he had it naturally. Kate walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away and folded her arms across her chest, not in a closed-off way but in the way of someone who has learned to occupy space carefully. "You did not have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "You tore up a legal document." "It was not legal," he said. "A person cannot be a debt." "Not in 1882, not in Kansas, not anywhere a human being should want to live." She studied him. "You are going to tell me you did it out of principle." "I did it out of principle, and because watching that man put his hand on you made something in my chest want to go through the table." He said it matter-of-factly, not like a boast, just a report of internal weather. "Both things can be true." Something shifted in Kate's expression. It was subtle, a slight softening around the eyes, though her jaw stayed set. "Who are you?" "Oscar Slater." "Nobody remarkable," he said. "I own a piece of land northeast of town. I drove cattle for about 8 years and I saved enough to buy something that is actually mine. I play cards honestly, I do not drink to excess, and I cannot sit still and watch a wrong happen if I have the means to address it." "That sounds like somebody's list of virtues from a church pamphlet," she said, and there was a dry edge in her voice that was not quite a smile but was definitely something. "I imagine it does," he said. "I am telling you anyway." A pause. "Thank you," Kate said, and she said it like she meant it, without the brittle edge she had used before. "For what you did in there. You did not have to make an enemy of Raymond Finch." "He was going to be my enemy either way once I took all his money," Oscar said. "I might as well earn it for a better reason." That got the smile. It was small and quick, like a bird moving through a field, but it was real and it did something to the air between them. "I have to go home," she said. "Do you need someone to walk with you? I have been walking home alone for 14 months. "I know," he said. "The offer stands regardless." She considered him for another moment, and Oscar Slater stood quietly in the starlight and let himself be considered, because he understood that this was a woman who had been hurt by careless men, and that the most important thing he could do right now was be exactly what he appeared to be. "All right," she said finally. They walked side by side through the quiet streets of Caldwell, not talking much at first. The boarding house district slid past, then the church, then the small houses at the edge of town where the streets turned back to dirt and the lantern light thinned out. Kate's place was a modest single-story house at the far end of a lane, with a kitchen garden that was well tended and a small barn that was leaning slightly to the left but still standing. "It is not much," she said, and he could hear the defensiveness in it, the armor that goes up when you are used to people judging what you have. "It is a house," he said. "It has a garden. That is more than a lot of people have." She stopped at the gate and turned to face him. "Why did you really do it?" The honest answer. Oscar was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I looked at your face," he said at last. "And I saw someone who had been told for a long time that they did not have the right to say no, and that is the kind of wrong that does not require me to know a person's name before I want to fix it." Kate Beckett looked at him in the darkness for a long time. Then she said, "Come to dinner tomorrow, 6 o'clock. I will make something proper." "I would like that very much," he said. She went inside. He waited until he heard the bolt slide home, and then he walked back toward town through the warm Kansas night with something unfamiliar and good settled in his chest. He was at her door at 6 o'clock the following evening with a bunch of wildflowers he had picked from the edge of the creek on his way in, because he had been raised right, and he did not arrive empty-handed. Kate opened the door wearing a clean blue dress and an expression that was working hard to be casual and not quite succeeding. "You found flowers," she said. "The creek is very generous this time of year," he said. She took them and found a jar for them on the windowsill, and he stood in her doorway and looked at the inside of the house, which was clean and precise in the way of someone who takes care of things, because taking care of things matters to them. There were books on a small shelf, which surprised him and then immediately made him feel ashamed of being surprised. There was a sampler on the wall that she had clearly done herself, green thread on white linen, with a Bible verse he recognized. There was a second chair at the table that she had clearly placed there specifically for tonight. Dinner was beef stew with biscuits, and it was extraordinary. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, meaning it. "My mother," she said. "She died when I was 12. Before that, she spent 4 years teaching me everything she knew, like she understood she would not have the chance later." She said it without self-pity, just as a fact, but he could hear the years of weight behind it. "She did a good job," he said. "She did." Kate looked at her bowl for a moment. "She also taught me to read properly and to keep accounts and to not let any man tell me my own worth, which has proved harder to hold on to." "Finch," he said. "Finch," she agreed. "He arrived about 6 months after Papa took ill, acting like a family friend. By the time Papa died, he had all the paperwork in order and I was already behind." She shook her head. "I should have fought harder earlier, but I was 21 and grieving, and I did not know enough about law to see what he was doing until it was done." Oscar was quiet for a moment. "Is the debt actually enforceable? The real debt, not the manufactured one?" "I honestly do not know," she said. "Papa did borrow some money from him years ago. That part is real. The rest of what Finch claims is built on top of it like a house of cards. I have never had the money to get a lawyer to look at it properly." "I know a man in Wichita," Oscar said. "A lawyer. An honest one, which I will grant you is a rarer thing than it should be. He helped a man I worked with on the drive settle a dispute that was not unlike this. He charges fair fees." Kate looked at him. "You have only known me for 1 day." "I know," he said. "I am just mentioning it. You do not have to do anything with the mention." She was quiet for a moment, and then something in her posture changed, a slight yielding, as if she had been holding a door closed and had decided to let it open a crack. "Tell me about this land of yours," she said. And so he did. He talked about the land the way people talk about things they love. It was about 340 acres, mostly grassland with a good creek running through the northeast corner, a stand of cottonwoods along the south boundary, and a slope on the west side that caught the morning light in a way that had made him stand there for 20 minutes on the first morning he walked it, just watching. The existing structures were minimal: a small cabin that needed significant work, a barn that was in better shape than the cabin, and a fence line that was partly down and needed to be rebuilt. He had spent the 3 months since purchasing it living in the cabin and working from before dawn to after dusk, patching and building and planning. "What will you run?" she asked. "Cattle to start. I have 30 head coming up from a rancher in Texas at the end of summer. I know cattle. I know how to work them and how to sell them and how the market moves. It is not glamorous work, but it is honest and it is mine." He looked at the table. "I have been working for other people since I was 14. There is something about working for yourself that I do not know how to explain properly." "No," she said quietly. "I think I understand it completely." They stayed at the table talking until the candles burned low, and when Oscar finally looked up and registered how late it had gotten, he was startled, because time had passed the way it only passes when you are so engaged with someone that the rest of the world dissolves at the edges. He left with a handshake, which was proper, and walked back to the boarding house in the dark, feeling like someone had opened a window in a room he had been breathing stale air in for a long time. He came back 3 days later, on the pretense of asking if she would like to ride out and see the land, and she said yes without hesitating, which told him something, and they rode out in the early morning when the air was still cool and the grass was silver with dew. The land was every bit as beautiful as he had described it, and Kate stood at the top of the western slope with the morning sun beginning its climb and the creek winking in the distance and the cottonwoods standing dark against the pale sky, and she said nothing for a long time. "You were not exaggerating," she said finally. "I would not exaggerate about this," he said. She turned and looked at the cabin. It was rough work, plain and pragmatic, but the bones of it were good, and you could see where he had already patched the roof and reframed two of the windows and replaced the rotten porch boards with new pine that was still bright and fragrant. "You did all this yourself?" "Mostly. A neighbor named Amos Greer helped me with the roof. He has a place about 4 miles east. Good man. His wife makes a molasses pie that is genuinely the best thing I have ever eaten." Kate laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh properly. Not the dry, near smile from before, but a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and it did something to him that he was not quite prepared for. He showed her the barn, which was solid and well organized, and the creek, where the water ran clear over a bed of small stones, and the cottonwood roots reached down into the bank, and the light came through the leaves in coins. They sat on the bank for a while, and he told her about the cattle drives, about the long weeks on the Kisham Trail with 20 men and 2,000 longhorns, and the sky going on forever, about the thunderstorms that rolled across the plains like walls of sound, about the night near the Red River crossing when a lightning strike started a grass fire, and they drove the cattle through the smoke with bandanas over their faces and prayers in their hearts. She told him about her father, about what Thomas Beckett had been like before the illness took him. He had been a quiet man with a talent for fixing machinery, and a stubborn optimism about farming that Kansas had spent 20 years trying to kill and had never quite managed. He had told her stories every night before bed until she was old enough to read them herself, and then he had told her to keep reading because the world was bigger than Caldwell and books were how you visited it without buying a train ticket. "Did you ever want to leave?" Oscar asked. "Every day for the last 2 years," she said, without hesitation. "But this house is mine. Papa built it. Finch has been trying to get his hands on it too, claiming the land it sits on is part of the debt. If I leave, I feel like he wins. He does not win just because you want a bigger life." She looked at him. "You sound very certain about that." "I am certain about that," he said. She looked at the creek for a while. "You are a strange man, Oscar Slater." "Strange how?" "Strange in the way that you say what you mean and mean what you say, and you do not seem to want anything from me in exchange." "I want your company," he said simply. "I enjoy talking to you. I have not enjoyed talking to someone this much in a long time." He looked at her directly. "That is the honest truth of it." The color that came into her face was brief, and she looked away quickly, but she was not displeased. He could see that clearly enough. They rode back to Caldwell in the afternoon, and at the edge of town where the lane branched, she turned to him and said, "I want to contact your lawyer in Wichita about the debt situation. Would you write down his name for me?" "I will do better," he said. "I will write him a letter introducing you if you would like. He will take you more seriously with a reference." "You would do that?" "I will do that," he said. She looked at him with that complicated expression she sometimes had, the one that mixed gratitude with a wariness that was not aimed at him personally, but at the memory of everyone who had made wariness necessary. Then she said quietly, "Thank you, Oscar." "It is nothing," he said. "It is not nothing," she said. "Stop calling things nothing when they are something." He looked at her for a moment and then smiled, and she looked at the smile and then looked away, and they parted at the crossroads with a warmth between them that neither of them named yet, but both of them carried home. The letter went to Wichita, and 3 weeks later, a reply came back from the lawyer, whose name was Edwin Croft, saying he would be willing to review the documentation and advising Kate on what papers to gather. It was a slow and careful process, the way legal things always are, and in the meantime, Kate and Oscar continued to see each other. He came into town twice a week, sometimes more when there was a reason. She rode out to the land once a week with a packed lunch and a willingness to help that he had tried to discourage, and she had flatly refused to honor. She mended things and organized the cabin while he worked the fence line, and they ate lunch on the porch in the shade of the new roof, and talked about everything, and nothing in the easy way of people who have established that the other person is safe. Raymond Finch watched from a distance and fumed. He had gone quiet after the night at the Silver Spur, which Oscar had expected, because men like Finch were cowards underneath, and cowards need time to rebuild their nerve when it has been publicly deflated. But quiet was not the same as gone, and Oscar never let himself forget that. Finch went to a man named Decker Cole. Cole was the kind of man who existed in every frontier town in the 1880s, nominally a businessman, actually a predator, with a finger in various enterprises that the law tried to avoid looking at directly. He ran a cattle-buying operation that was not above purchasing livestock of questionable origin, and he had enough money and enough intimidation behind him to make most of Caldwell's complaints about him dissolve before they reached the sheriff. What Finch wanted from Cole was pressure, and Cole provided it in the form of a visit to Kate's property one morning while Oscar was in town at the land office. Two men arrived on horseback and told her that Cole had an interest in the land and would be making her an offer shortly, and that she might want to give it serious consideration, and that the word serious carried implications that the horses and the men's posture made abundantly clear. Kate thanked them politely and shut the door and locked it, and then stood in her kitchen for a long moment before she decided she was not going to be frightened into anything. She went to find Oscar. He was coming out of the land office when she came down the street, and the look on her face told him immediately that something had happened. She told him about the two men in flat, precise sentences, not dramatizing it but not minimizing it either, and he listened with his hands very still at his sides, which she had learned was what he did when he was managing something strong. "Cole," he said, "do you know him?" "I know of him. He has been buying up distressed properties on the south side of town. I heard about it from Amos Greer." His jaw was tight for a moment, and then it relaxed deliberately. "This is connected to Finch." "Obviously," she said. "All right," he said. "Then we go to the sheriff." The sheriff of Caldwell in 1882 was a man named Harris, who was neither corrupt nor heroic, but was genuinely trying to do a difficult job in a complicated town. He listened to Kate's account of the morning's visit carefully, asked a few precise questions, and made a note in his ledger. He could not arrest anyone for delivering a message, he explained, but he would pay a personal visit to Decker Cole and make it clear that intimidation of a private citizen was not something he intended to ignore. "That may not stop him," Kate said when they were outside. "It may not," Oscar agreed. "But it puts Cole on notice that you have people in your corner. Men like Cole prefer to work in the dark. Light makes them cautious." She looked at him. "You are in my corner." "I have been in your corner since the moment Finch grabbed your wrist," he said, and the way he said it was so plain and firm and uncomplicated that she felt it land somewhere very deep in her chest. They were standing on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, and the sun was bright, and the street was busy with its ordinary business of wagons and horses and people calling to each other. And Kate Beckett looked at Oscar Slater in the afternoon light and felt something she had been carefully not feeling for weeks come loose from its moorings. "Oscar," she said. "Kate," he said. "I am not very good at this," she said. "At trust, at letting someone stand in my corner without waiting for them to reveal what they want from it." "I know," he said. "But I am trying," she said. "I want you to know that I am trying." He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached out and very carefully, with the particular gentleness of someone who understands that gesture has weight, took her hand. She let him. They stood there on the boardwalk in the sunlight, not saying anything, just standing there with their hands loosely linked, and it was one of the most significant things either of them had done in years. Edwin Croft arrived from Wichita on a Tuesday in late August, riding the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe line in, and carrying a leather case full of documents and a pair of reading spectacles, and the particular focused energy of a man who genuinely enjoys untangling dishonest paperwork. He was in his mid-40s, spare and precise, with a dry sense of humor that surfaced occasionally like a fish briefly showing itself. He spent 2 days going through everything Kate had, every paper Finch had ever given her, every letter, every account record, and comparing it against what he had been able to obtain about Raymond Finch's legal history in Caldwell County. On the third morning, he sat down at Kate's kitchen table with his spectacles on and a very specific kind of satisfied expression on his face. "Mr. Finch has been inventive," he said. "I will give him that. He has layered falsified interest calculations on top of legitimate principle, and he has done it gradually enough and with enough proper-looking paperwork that it might have convinced a different judge. But the original debt your father contracted was for $240. The current amount Finch has claimed is outstanding is, by my count, 23 times that figure, arrived at through interest rates that were never agreed to in writing and would in any case be illegal under Kansas territorial law." Kate sat very still. "So the real debt has been paid," Croft said. "I believe you actually exceeded the original amount through your work at the boarding house and the dry goods counter in the first 8 months after your father died, before Finch began his escalation. The debt marker he presented the other week at the Silver Spur was legally worthless regardless of what happened to the paper." Oscar, who was sitting across the table, exhaled slowly. "Can you make that stick in court?" "I do not think it will need to go to court," Croft said. "I intend to present Finch with a detailed account of my findings and a very clear description of the charges that could be filed against him for fraud and attempted extortion if he pursues this further. Men like Finch generally calculate quite quickly when the arithmetic stops working in their favor." The meeting with Finch happened the following afternoon in the office of the county judge, with Sheriff Harris present as a witness, because Oscar had asked him to be, and Harris had agreed that it seemed prudent. Croft laid out his findings with the calm precision of someone reading a ledger, and Raymond Finch's attorney, a nervous young man from a neighboring county who had clearly not been given full information before taking the case, sat very quietly and got paler as the reading progressed. Finch himself blustered. He threatened. He made vague references to his history in the town and his standing and who he knew. And then Croft placed a specific statute on the table and described exactly what the penalty for extortion was under Kansas law, and Finch went quiet the way a fire goes quiet when you take away its air. He signed the release of all claims against Catherine Beckett and the property of Thomas Beckett, deceased, before sundown. Kate stood outside the judge's office afterward in the long golden afternoon light, and she held the signed document in both hands, and Oscar watched her read it again, and then look up at the sky. "It is over," she said. "It is over," he confirmed. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment, not quite crying but close to it, and he stood near her and did not say anything because some moments do not need words, and he had the wisdom to know which ones. Then she turned and walked the 2 steps between them and put her arms around him, and he held her, and they stood there in the middle of the street in Caldwell, Kansas on a summer afternoon in 1882 while the whole ordinary world went on around them, and it was the realest thing either of them had felt in a long time. He did not pull back. He held on. Decker Cole, deprived of Finch's motivation and quietly warned by Sheriff Harris, let the matter of Kate's land drop without further incident. He had other schemes and other properties, and he was, at bottom, a man who pursued the path of least resistance. Kate was no longer a path of least resistance, and so he moved on. The summer deepened and then began to turn toward fall, and in that turning the world took on the particular color and weight that autumn brings to the Kansas plains, a long golden burning that makes everything look briefly like it is on the edge of something. The cottonwoods along Oscar's Creek went yellow, and the grass shifted from green to amber, and the mornings began to carry a crispness that would deepen into cold in another few weeks. The 30 head of cattle arrived from Texas on a warm Friday, driven up by a pair of hands that Oscar had arranged beforehand and paid to do the trailing. He spent the whole day working them into his pastures and getting them settled with the focus of someone doing something they knew how to do and loved doing. And Kate came out in the afternoon and watched from the fence line, leaning her arms on the top rail, and the look on her face watching him work was one she was not managing as carefully as she usually managed her expressions. He came to the fence after a while, dusty and happy in the way of someone who has just done honest work, and she said, without preamble, "You are good at that." "I have been doing it most of my life," he said. "I know, but watching someone do a thing they are genuinely good at is its own kind of pleasure." She tilted her head slightly. "You love this." "I love this," he agreed simply. "I love it in a way I have been putting off for a long time. Like I kept telling myself, one more season, one more drive, one more year saving, and then finally I stopped telling myself that and just did it." "What made you finally do it?" she asked. He looked out at the cattle moving in the late sun and was quiet for a moment. "A man I worked with on the trail for 3 seasons. Good man, tough as boot leather, and with more sense than anyone I have ever met. He died the spring of 1880 helping cross the Red River in a bad flood. Just gone between one moment and the next." He was quiet again. He had been saying he was going to buy his own land for 5 years. He had the money. He just kept waiting for the right time. He looked at Kate. "After that, I stopped waiting for the right time." Kate was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am sorry about your friend." "Thank you," he said. She reached across the fence rail and put her hand over his, and this time she did it without thinking about it, which was its own kind of progress. Oscar looked down at their hands on the fence rail and then up at her face, and something passed between them that had been building for weeks, that particular charged stillness that exists just before something becomes undeniable. "Kate," he said. "Yes," she said, which was technically an answer to a question he had not yet asked, and they both recognized that. He leaned across the fence rail and kissed her, gently and deliberately, with the same kind of care he put into everything, and she leaned into it and kissed him back, and the cattle moved in the long grass behind him, and the cottonwoods turned in the autumn wind, and the sky above the Kansas plains was enormous and full of the last of the summer's blue. When they drew back, she looked at him with those steady dark eyes that he had come to understand were her truest self, the self that did not perform or protect, but simply existed. "I have been waiting for you to do that for approximately 6 weeks, she said. "I was being respectful of your process," he said. "Your process was extremely slow," she said. He laughed and she laughed, and it was easy and warm and real. After that, things moved with the natural momentum of 2 people who have established trust and then broken open the dam that was holding everything else back. They rode together in the mornings when the dew was still on the grass and the light was fresh, and the world felt like it was being shown to them for the first time. They talked for hours about everything, about what they wanted, about what they feared, about what the future might look like if they were building it together. They spent Sundays at the Greer farm down the road, where Amos and his wife Clara welcomed them with the easy warmth of people who had been quietly hoping this would happen ever since Amos had mentioned to Oscar that the woman in town who was dealing with Finch was something worth noticing. Clara Greer was a cheerful, plain-spoken woman of about 40 who had an opinion on everything, and delivered it with such goodwill that it never felt like an imposition. She liked Kate immediately and thoroughly, declaring her inside of 10 minutes to be sensible and genuine and not full of her own importance, which is rarer than you would think. And Kate in turn liked Clara in the way you like people who say exactly what they mean without cruelty. Amos Greer was quieter than his wife, but no less warm. A big man with a sun-weathered face and large, capable hands, and the particular settled quality of someone who has found exactly the life they wanted and is profoundly grateful for it. He and Oscar had developed the easy shorthand friendship of men who work alongside each other and respect what they see, and watching them interact, Kate understood something important about Oscar, that he built relationships slowly and carefully, and then kept them well. It was Clara in November who said what both Kate and Oscar had been circling around for weeks without landing. They were all four sitting in the Greer kitchen after a Sunday dinner, with the fire going and the coffee hot and the wind coming down from the north carrying the promise of the season's first real cold. And Clara looked across the table at the two of them sitting side by side and said, with characteristic directness, "Are you two going to get married, or are you going to keep dancing around it until spring?" The silence that followed was brief and full of color. Oscar looked at Kate. Kate looked at Oscar. Then Kate looked at Clara and said, "I believe that is a conversation for us to have between ourselves, Clara." "Obviously," Clara said, not at all chastened. "I am just noting that from the outside it looks rather overdue." Amos, without looking up from his coffee, said, "Clara." "I am just saying," Clara said. The ride home that evening was quiet in a charged way, the kind of quiet that has a lot in it. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were very close overhead the way they get in November on the plains, and the horses moved at an easy walk through the dark. They stopped at the lane where their roads divided, as they often did, but this time neither of them moved to part. "She is not wrong," Oscar said eventually. "Clara usually is not," Kate said. He looked at her in the starlight. "Kate, I have known for a while what I want. I have been going at the pace I thought was right for you, because the last thing I want is to rush you into something after everything that happened with Finch." "You are not Finch," she said. "You are as far from Finch as one man can be from another man." "I know that," he said. "I just wanted you to know it too." "I know it," she said quietly. "I have known it for a long time." He reached into his coat pocket and she saw with a start that he had a small ring in his hand. It was simple, a plain gold band with a small garnet set into it, modest and beautiful in the way of things chosen carefully rather than expensively. He had bought it in Wichita 3 weeks ago, on the day he rode there with Croft to pick up some finalized paperwork, and he had been carrying it since, waiting for the moment that was right rather than the moment that was convenient. "Kate Beckett," he said, "I would very much like to spend the rest of my life with you on that land, building that life, if you will agree to it." She looked at the ring in his hand in the cold starlight, and she looked at his face, and she thought about the night in the Silver Spur when he had torn up that marker and said she owed nobody, and about every morning since, and about what it had meant to be seen by someone who asked nothing back, and she felt the last of the walls she had been maintaining for years simply let go. "Yes," she said, "I will absolutely agree to it." He put the ring on her finger, and she held it up in the starlight for a moment, and then she leaned across the space between their horses and kissed him with a warmth that made the cold night feel like summer. They were married in December, 3 days before Christmas, in the little church in Caldwell, where the morning light came through the east windows and landed in pale gold bars across the pine floor. Clara Greer stood with Kate and Amos stood with Oscar, and Sheriff Harris was there with his wife, and Edwin Croft had ridden down from Wichita specifically to attend, which touched Kate more than she said. A dozen other people from town and the surrounding farms filled the pews, because even in a town as rough-edged as Caldwell, there is a hunger for ceremony and goodness that does not go away. Kate wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that her mother had once worn and that she had carefully altered to fit herself, and she carried a small bouquet of dried flowers that Clara had made for her from the summer's last blooms. Oscar wore a clean dark suit that he had bought in Wichita and a white shirt and his best boots, and when he saw her come through the door of the church, his face did something that Amos, standing beside him, would describe to Clara later as the look of a man who cannot believe his luck and knows it. The minister spoke words that were both old and specific, and Oscar said his vows with the same plain directness he applied to everything, looking at Kate steadily the whole time, and Kate said hers in a clear voice that did not waver, because she had decided that this was a thing worth doing without qualification. When it was done, the little church felt full of something that had nothing to do with the number of people in it. They celebrated that evening at the Greer farm, which was large enough to hold everyone, with a fiddle player named Tamaz who had come down from a ranch north of town, and who played with the particular joyful precision of someone who loves the instrument. They danced on the swept barn floor in the lamplight, Kate and Oscar and Clara and Amos, and the sheriff with his wife, and various others in various configurations. And the music was warm against the cold December night outside, and the world was very good. Oscar danced with Kate the way he did most things, with complete attention, and she matched him, and Clara whispered to Amos in the corner that it was the most satisfying thing she had seen in years, and Amos squeezed her hand and agreed. They moved Kate's things out to the land the following week, loading her father's furniture and her books and her kitchen things and her mother's sampler, and everything else she valued onto a wagon, and carrying it out to the cabin, which Oscar had been working on for the past month specifically to make more suitable for 2 people. He had added a proper kitchen area and replaced the single bedroom window with one that was large enough to let in real morning light, and he had built a second bookshelf which he had positioned, he told her, to receive the afternoon sun. She stood in the cabin with her hands on her hips and looked around at everything and then at him. "You built me a bookshelf," she said. "I built us a bookshelf," he said, "but specifically with your books in mind." She shook her head slowly, not in disagreement but in the way of someone absorbing something they did not expect to have. Then she began placing her books on the shelf, and he helped her, and they talked about each one as it went up, which ones were her favorites, which ones her father had given her, which ones she had bought herself with money she had saved from her wages. When the shelf was full, it looked exactly right. That winter was a hard one by Kansas standards. The cold came down in earnest in January, and the snow lay on the plains in a white and unbroken silence for weeks at a stretch, and the cattle had to be watched carefully and fed supplemental hay that Oscar had laid in that fall with the foresight of a man who had spent years on the trail and understood what winter could do. They worked together through it, rising before dawn to break ice from the water troughs, driving hay out to the cattle in the wagon, keeping the animals moving through the worst of the cold. It was not glamorous work. It was heavy and cold and repetitive and physically demanding, and some mornings Kate's hands were so stiff by the time they came back inside that she had to hold them near the stove for 10 minutes before they felt like her own again. But she did not complain, because she had chosen this and she understood what it was, and more than that, she found a deep satisfaction in it that she had not anticipated. The land was theirs, the work was theirs, the life that was growing out of it was theirs, and there was a quality to earning something that she had been denied for 2 years by Finch's depredations, and that now she had back in full. Oscar watched her work and felt things he did not always have words for. He had spent years on the trail surrounded by men, and he had been good at that life and content in it, but contentment was a modest thing compared to what this was. What this was a particular fullness, as if all the rooms he had not known were empty were suddenly full of the right things. They talked in the evenings by the fire, reading, planning the spring, talking about what they wanted the next years to look like. Oscar wanted to expand the herd carefully, sell his beef to buyers in Kansas City, build the operation into something that could sustain itself and them without the brutal uncertainty of the trail. Kate talked about starting a garden in earnest in the spring, not just vegetables but medicinal herbs, and possibly buying a milk cow and eventually having chickens. Small things, domestic things, the kind of things that look modest from the outside and are in fact the entire architecture of a life. She also mentioned, in February, with the particular careful casualness of someone delivering significant information, that she was expecting. Oscar went very still for a moment and then looked at her with an expression that was simultaneously disbelief and joy and a kind of awed gravity, all happening at once across his face. "When?" he managed. "Late summer, I think," she said. "Possibly early fall." He crossed the room and sat next to her on the bench by the fire and took both her hands in his, and for a moment he just looked at her, This woman he had found over a card table in a saloon in an act of basic decency that had turned out to be the most important thing he had ever done. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "I feel very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but I am fine, Oscar." He nodded, and then, in a voice that was not quite steady, he said, "That is the most remarkable news I have ever received." She squeezed his hands. "Do not go soft on me now, Slater." "I make no promises," he said, and his voice was very warm and slightly rough around the edges, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat by the fire while the winter wind moved around the cabin, and the life they were building settled deeper into the earth. The spring came the way springs come on the plains, slowly and then all at once, the snow retreating, and the grass coming up vivid green, and the creek running high and musical with the melt, and the cottonwoods budding pale and new against the brightening sky. Kate's garden went in on a series of warm April mornings, and by May it was already showing, neat rows of green against the dark earth, with the medicinal herbs along the south wall of the cabin where they would get the most sun. The cattle had come through the winter in good shape. Oscar had lost 2 head to the cold, which he had accounted for in his projections, and which was within the range of reasonable. His relationship with the Kansas City buyers, which he had been cultivating since the fall, was developing into something workable, and there was the real possibility of a profitable first full year on the land if the summer cooperated. Amos Greer came over one May morning with a proposition. There was a stretch of fencing along the boundary between their 2 properties that would be useful to both of them if it were rebuilt to a shared standard, and Amos suggested they tackle it together over a week and then share the cost of materials. Oscar agreed immediately, and they spent a week working the fence line together from sunrise to late afternoon, talking as they worked in the easy, comfortable way of men who have established that they enjoy each other's company. Amos talked about the early days on his own land before Clara came out from Missouri, about what it was to build a place alone and how different it was once there was someone to build it with. "Different how?" Oscar asked, sinking a post. "Better in ways that are hard to say without sounding foolish," Amos said. "You understand the work differently when it is for something larger than yourself, and the days are just better, even the hard ones." Oscar thought about waking up every morning to the sound of Kate moving in the kitchen, to the smell of coffee, to the sight of her in the morning light reading while the water heated. He thought about what the cabin had felt like before she was in it, which he could still remember, and about what it felt like now. "Yes," he said, "I understand completely." Kate was beginning to show visibly by June, and she wore it with the same practicality with which she wore everything, without fuss, adapting her work to her changing body and accepting Oscar's help without too much argument, which for Kate was significant progress. He had a tendency to hover that she found alternately touching and exasperating, and she told him so, which made him laugh and moderate himself slightly. She was also writing letters, which was something she had apparently been doing quietly for a while. Letters to a cousin in Colorado she had not been in contact with for years. Letters to an old schoolteacher who had retired to Missouri. Letters to Edwin Croft just to correspond, because she had liked him and found him genuinely interesting. She had a life of the mind that she had kept mostly private through the worst of the Finch years, because there had not been space to let it breathe. And now it was expanding, and Oscar watched it expand with a pleasure that was partly admiration, and partly just the simple joy of watching someone you love become more fully themselves. July brought heat and the fullness of summer, and Kate at 7 months along, moving a little more slowly than she was accustomed to and sleeping deeply and dreaming, she said, of rivers, which seemed as good a thing as any to dream about. The garden was producing abundantly. The cattle were fat on summer grass. The cabin had been extended with a second room that summer, built with help from Amos and 2 other men from neighboring farms who had been recruited with the promise of a proper supper. a promise that Kate fulfilled with the kind of cooking that earned her a reputation along the valley that would last for years. She received a letter from her cousin, Mary Beckett, who lived in Durango, Colorado with her husband and 3 children. Mary wrote in a warm and vivid way that made Kate laugh several times reading it, and she wrote back the same day, a long letter full of the year's events, the land, Oscar, the garden, the coming baby. She sealed it and posted it the next day in town, and when she came home, Oscar was on the porch in the evening cool, and she sat beside him and told him about Mary, and he listened with the attention he always gave her, and she felt the pleasant completeness of sharing a life with someone who wanted to know all of it. The baby came on a warm evening in late September, when the harvest moon was rising over the eastern plains, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to turn. Clara Greer came to help, as she had been planning to do for months, and she was efficient and calm and absolutely competent, and the whole business, while not quick or without difficulty, went well. Oscar waited on the porch with Amos, who had come along because he understood that waiting alone was harder, and the 2 of them sat in the dark listening to the sounds of the night, and not saying much and being, in their different ways, very nervous. The cry, when it came, went through Oscar like a current. Clara appeared in the doorway and said, "A healthy boy. Kate is well. Come in." Oscar went in. Kate was sitting up in the bed, looking tired and luminous in the lamplight, and she was holding a very new and very loud person who had Oscar's dark hair and Kate's sharp little eyebrows, and appeared to have a significant amount to say about having been recently born. Oscar sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and his wife, and the feeling in his chest was so large that he did not try to put it in words, just let it be there, enormous and complete. "He is extraordinary," he said finally. "He is extremely loud," Kate said, but her voice was warm. "He takes after you," Oscar said. She looked up at him with those dark eyes, and she was exhausted and beautiful and more herself than he had ever seen her, and she said, "I love you very much, Oscar Slater." "I love you very much," he said, "Kate Slater." They named the boy Thomas for her father, which had been her idea from early in the pregnancy, and Oscar had agreed immediately and without qualification, because it was exactly the right name and he would not have argued with it for anything in the world. Thomas Slater was a vigorous and curious baby who slept adequately and ate enthusiastically, and regarded everything around him with the particular intensity of infants, who seem to understand that there is a great deal to learn, and that they have no time to waste. Kate fed him and held him, and sang to him in a low, clear voice that Oscar would sometimes stop what he was doing to listen to from the next room, just because it was the best sound he had ever heard. The winter after Thomas's birth was milder than the last, which felt like a gift. They were both tired in the way that new parents are tired, a bone-deep tiredness that is also somehow full of joy, and the milder temperatures meant the daily cattle work was less brutal, and they could pace themselves more reasonably. Clara came twice a week for the first month, bringing food and offering to take the baby so Kate could sleep, and Kate accepted with gratitude that Clara waved off every time. Edwin Croft sent a letter in November congratulating them, and Oscar replied with a long and detailed account of the farm's first year, which had indeed produced a profit, modest but real, and of the baby, whom he described as loud and excellent and entirely consuming. Croft wrote back that he was glad to hear it, and that the land documents were all in perfect order, and that he hoped the next year was equally favorable. There was a brief moment of trouble in the early spring, when Decker Cole, apparently recovered from his winter caution, sent a man to the neighboring farm of a man named Peters with an aggressive offer on Peters's property. Peters was struggling after a bad fall had kept him from working through December and January, and Cole's offer was deliberately structured to look like salvation while being in practice predatory. Peters, who knew Oscar from the fence work and from Sunday dinner at the Greers, came to ask Oscar's opinion. Oscar took him to Edwin Croft by letter, and Croft's reply came back within a week with a clear legal assessment of the offer and a counter-strategy. Peters did not sell, and Croft's letter apparently also got to Sheriff Harris through some channel that Oscar did not fully track, and Cole was once again put on notice that the community he was trying to exploit had people in it who were paying attention. Cole sold his interests in Caldwell County entirely by the summer of that year, and moved his operations further west, into territory where he apparently calculated the resistance would be thinner. This was a relief to most of the farming and ranching community around Caldwell, and Oscar and Kate received more than a few bottles of preserves and smoked meats as an oblique form of thanks over the following months. Raymond Finch, shorn of his scheme and his backer, and apparently a good deal of his confidence, tried to reinvent himself with moderate success as a more legitimate businessman, which mostly meant he troubled no one very specifically and drank in a quieter and more solitary fashion. He and Kate passed each other in town occasionally, and she never spoke to him and he never approached her, and the transaction of his absence from her life was, in its way, the cleanest thing he had ever done. Kate rode into town most weeks, Thomas bundled against her in the cooler months or riding in the wagon seat beside Oscar when the weather was fine. She had resumed her friendship with old Mrs. Garrity at the dry goods counter, not out of need for work but out of genuine affection, and she helped there voluntarily when she felt like it, which Mrs. Garrity accepted gratefully, and Kate enjoyed because she liked people and being useful and the flow of information that a dry goods counter in a small town provides. She also started teaching. It was Clara's suggestion, and it happened almost by accident. Clara's youngest daughter was struggling with her letters, and Kate had offered to help one Sunday afternoon, and the lesson had gone so well that Clara's daughter had gone from refusing to read to demanding books within 3 weeks. Word spread the way it does in small communities, and by autumn of the second year, Kate was running a small school on Tuesday and Thursday mornings in the church room, taking 7 children from farms around the valley and teaching them reading and arithmetic and basic geography, and whatever else seemed useful and interesting. She was a remarkable teacher, patient and exacting and genuinely excited about the subject of learning itself, and the children who came to her taught themselves more than they understood, because Kate had the gift of making a child feel that the discovery was their own. She did it without pay for the first season, because the families could not afford much, and then in the second season the parents organized themselves and produced a modest monthly collection that Kate accepted with graceful practicality. Oscar was proud of her in a way that was entirely free of complication, the clean pride of someone watching a person they love do something they were always meant to do. He told her so one evening when Thomas was asleep and they were sitting on the porch in the warm summer dark. "You are exactly right in that room with those children," he said. "The way they look at you." "They are good children," she said. "They are lucky children," he said. She turned to look at him, and the moonlight was on her face, and she looked both older and younger than the woman he had met in a saloon 3 years before, older in that her life had more weight and texture in it, younger in that the pinched wariness of the Finch years had fully dissolved. She looked like herself, which was the best version of what anyone could look like. "I was thinking," she said, with the particular careful tone she used when she was broaching something she had been thinking about for a while, "that we might need a larger school, if we want to take in more children." "We could build one," he said. "It would need to be a proper structure," she said. "Not just the church room. Amos's boy is good with carpentry," Oscar said, "and Peters owes us a favor." She looked at him. "You would do that." "I would organize it," he said. "You would run the school, different roles but equal weight." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her doing the calculations, not financial ones but the internal kind, assessing what she wanted and whether she was allowed to want it, and he watched the moment when she decided that she was. "All right," she said. "Let us build a school." They broke ground on it that October, on a plot of land that the county donated after a petition that Oscar drafted and had signed by 27 families in the area. It was a simple rectangular building, one room, with good windows on the south and east sides for light, a stove, a proper blackboard that Kate ordered from a company in St. Louis, and a set of benches and desks that Amos's son Jacob built over the winter with a care and precision that left everyone who saw the finished work quietly amazed. It opened in the spring of 1885. 12 children arrived on the first morning. Kate stood at the door of the new building in the April light, clean and bright-windowed and smelling of new wood, and she watched them come in 2 and 3s down the road. And Oscar was standing a little behind her because he understood that this was her moment and he was there to witness it, not to take any part of it. She turned and looked at him over her shoulder, and her face was full of a happiness that was specific and earned, not the happiness of luck but the happiness of a thing built with both hands over years, and he smiled back at her with a fullness in his chest that he was no longer embarrassed by. She went inside. He stood on the step and listened to her voice beginning, clear and warm and certain, telling 12 children that the first thing they were going to learn today was how the alphabet worked, and that by the end of the year they would be reading, every one of them, and she sounded like she absolutely believed it, which meant they would. He walked back to the wagon and drove home through the spring morning. Thomas was 3 that fall, a serious and energetic child with an opinion about everything, and a vocabulary that made people stop and look at him when he talked, because he sounded much older than he was. He loved animals with a particular devotion, following Oscar around the barn from the time he could walk without falling, wanting to know the name of everything and the reason for everything and whether the calf understood that it was a calf. He is going to ask questions until the end of time, Oscar told Kate one evening. He gets it from both of us, she said. More from you, he said. Debatable, she said, and he laughed. She was expecting again by the winter of that year. She told him over breakfast on a Tuesday morning, the same careful, casual tone as the first time, and he did the same thing he had done the first time, going still and then looking at her with that layered expression of joy and gravity, and then he reached across the table and took her hand. You are well, he said. I am very well, she said. A little tired, but I am always a little tired. The school will be on a break schedule in the summer, which helps. We should write to Mary, he said. She will want to know. Kate smiled at the mention of her cousin, with whom she now corresponded regularly and whose letters were among the things she looked forward to most. I already did, she said. I wrote to her last week. He shook his head, amused. Of course you did. The second child arrived the following July, a girl this time, born in the early morning when the sky was just beginning to lighten from black to gray, and the meadowlarks were starting up in the grass outside the window. The birth was faster than the first, and Clara, once again present, was afterwards found sitting in the kitchen with her hand on her heart, saying it had been something of a sprint. They named her Elena for Oscar's mother, who had died when he was 17. He had not spoken of her often, not because the memory was painful but because he was a private man, and when Kate had asked in the middle of the night, holding the baby in the lamplight, what name he wanted, he had said Elena very quietly and immediately, and Kate had looked at him with an understanding that did not require words. Elena came into the world with her own clear opinions about it, expressed primarily through volume in the first weeks. Thomas, now nearly 4, examined her with the focused attention of a naturalist and pronounced her very small but probably all right, which struck Oscar as a reasonable assessment. The children grew. The farm grew. The school grew, eventually requiring a second teacher, a young woman named Josephine Wells who came out from Wichita on the recommendation of Edwin Croft, who had been maintaining a quiet watching brief over Kate's educational project from a distance and apparently knew the right people. Josephine was 23 and sharp and dedicated, and she and Kate developed a friendship rooted in mutual respect and a shared conviction that children from farming communities deserved as good an education as children from any city, and she stayed for 3 years before going back to Wichita to establish her own school there, which she wrote to Kate about regularly, and which Kate followed with great interest and considerable pride. The valley around Caldwell changed in those years, as the 1880s turned toward the 1890s. The cattle trail traffic thinned as the railroads expanded and the range was fenced, and what had been open country became ordered land with fixed boundaries and established roads. Oscar managed the transition carefully, focusing on building relationships with the Kansas City buyers and diversifying slightly into hogs, which required less rangeland and could be profitably sold through the same channels. He also, in the spring of 1888, was asked by a delegation of his neighboring farmers to stand for election to the county committee, which was a local governing body that oversaw things like roads and water rights and the coordination of community resources. He told them he would think about it and came home and told Kate about it at dinner. She put her fork down and looked at him with bright eyes. "You should do it. I'm not certain I am the right person for. You are organized, you are fair, you read situations clearly and do not panic, and you have a reputation for honesty that is worth more in that room than anything else," she said. "You should do it." "You make it sound simple," he said. "I am simplifying," she said, "but the core of it is true." He thought about it for another week and then agreed to stand. He was elected with a majority that surprised him and did not surprise Kate at all, and he served on the committee for 2 terms, working primarily on water rights infrastructure and road maintenance, unglamorous subjects that turned out to be of genuine and practical importance to every farm in the county. He came home from committee meetings sometimes frustrated and sometimes satisfied, and always with something to say about it. And Kate listened and asked sharp questions and offered opinions that were usually better than what he had been thinking, and the pattern of their life together settled into a richness that neither of them had imagined from the beginning of it. Thomas started at the school when he was 5, which was a minor domestic drama because he had very clear ideas about how things should be taught, and Kate had to establish early and firmly that the teacher was the teacher, and the student was the student regardless of whose kitchen they shared in the mornings. Thomas accepted this with a grudging grace that made his father quietly laugh behind his coffee cup. Alina, at 3, was already interested in the horses, with a single-minded focus that Oscar recognized as genuine and decided to encourage carefully. He taught her to sit in the saddle on a gentle mare named Copper that summer, holding her steady while she got the feel of it, and the expression on her face when the horse moved beneath her was one of pure, uncomplicated delight that he would remember for the rest of his life. Kate watched from the fence, the same fence she had leaned on years ago watching Oscar work his cattle in, and she felt the fullness of the scene, her daughter on the horse and her husband walking beside them in the afternoon sun, and the land around them that was theirs in a way that no one could take away. She thought briefly about the night in the Silver Spur, about the grip on her wrist and the quiet cold of Finch's triumph, and the silence of all those men who did not speak, and then about the man who stood up. She had never asked Oscar afterward what it had cost him to make that move, to declare in front of a roomful of people that a thing was wrong when doing so made him enemies. He was not the kind of man who talked about what things cost him. But she knew enough about the world to know that it had not been free, and she had carried that knowledge as a kind of foundation stone in everything she understood about who he was. He came back to the fence with Alina on the horse, leading Copper by the bridle, and Alina's cheeks were bright and her eyes were shining, and she said to Kate with total conviction, "Mama, I am very good at this." "You are learning," Kate said. "Learning is the start of being good." Alina considered this seriously. "But I am also very good." Oscar caught Kate's eye over Alina's head, and they exchanged the particular look of parents who are keeping a straight face with some difficulty. "You are doing wonderfully," Kate said. That satisfied Alina entirely. The years moved in the way that good years move, not slowly and not quickly but with a texture, each season distinct, and each one adding something to the whole. Kate's school became a permanent fixture of the valley's community life, eventually supported by a modest county budget that Oscar, from his position on the committee, had worked for 3 years to establish. The farm was stable and increasingly profitable. Amos and Clara Greer remained their closest friends, and the weekly Sunday dinners were a fixture of their life that the children grew up regarding as simply a fact of the world. The way the Greers were always there. Clara's molasses pie was always remarkable, and the adults talked too long over coffee. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man with his mother's quickness of mind and his father's quietness, and a particular talent for mathematics that led him to spend hours with the account books and the land records making calculations that he then came to present to Oscar with a 10-year-old's combination of nervousness and certainty. Eleanor grew into a girl who was happiest outdoors, on horseback, or following the creek, or climbing the cottonwoods along the south boundary, with a fearlessness that gave Kate occasional gray hairs and Oscar a complicated pride. In the fall of 1889, a third child came, another boy, whom they named Samuel after Oscar's father, a quiet man who had died of a bad winter when Oscar was 12, and who had been, Oscar said carefully one night, not always easy, but honest in the ways that mattered, and I think I owe what I know about honest work to him as much as to anything else. Samuel arrived with a head of red hair that baffled both parents and delighted Clara Greer, who maintained with great confidence that it must have come from a grandparent on one side or the other, and the color would stay all his life and become one of the most recognizable things about him. The household was full in a way that was also sometimes exhausting and also exactly right. 3 children and 2 parents, and a farm and a school, and a community and a life that had been built entirely by the hands that lived in it. Kate marked the 10th anniversary of the night in the Silver Spur without telling Oscar she had done it. It was a Tuesday in June, and she was at her desk in the school room after the children had gone home, marking letters in a student's copybook, and the summer evening light was coming through the good south windows, and she could hear the sound of the prairie and the distant creek and somewhere a meadowlark, and she put down her pen and sat back and thought about all of it. She thought about Thomas Beckett, her father, and about who he had been and what he had given her and what she had done with it. She thought about the years of Finch's grinding small cruelties and the way they had tried to reduce her, and how she had kept herself from being fully reduced through sheer stubbornness, and the memory of her mother's voice. She thought about a man in a dark coat tearing a piece of paper and saying, without heat or performance, that she owed nobody here. She picked up her pen and finished the copybook, and then she walked the 2 miles home along the creek path in the long summer evening, and the cottonwoods were green, and the water was low and clear, and the light was golden on everything. Oscar was on the porch when she came up the lane, mending a piece of harness with the focused patience he brought to any task that required it. He looked up when she came through the gate, and she walked up the porch steps and sat beside him and leaned her head on his shoulder, and he set the harness down and put his arm around her. "How were the children today?" he asked. "Wonderful and exhausting," she said. Thomas Greer wrote a full page about the prairie dog he found by the east fence, and I had to tell him that while his spelling was very good, a composition requires sentences that relate to each other in some logical order. "Did he take that well?" "He is 8, she said. "No." "But he will." They sat in the evening cool while the light dropped and the children's sounds from inside the house eventually stilled as Clara, who often stayed on days when Kate was late at the school, got them settled. The stars began, one by one as they always did, emerging in the deepening blue above the prairie, and the world went quietly dark and good. "Oscar," Kate said. "Kate," he said. "I have been thinking today about how everything got to be this way," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What made you think of it today?" "No particular reason," she said. "Or all reasons. Sometimes you just look around at a life and want to understand how it came to be exactly what it is. He thought about this. An act of stubbornness on your part, he said, and a card game I should not have won as decisively as I did, and a man who made me angry at exactly the right moment. Is that all? She said, and there was a smile in her voice. And you, he said, opening a door that you had every reason to keep closed. That was the essential part. I could have torn up 100 markers and it would not have become this without you deciding to trust it. She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him in the dark, this man who had ridden into Caldwell on an ordinary evening and done an extraordinary thing without calculation and without agenda, who had said she owed nobody and then spent years proving it through the specific patient work of actually being there. I love you, she said. I love you, he said, more than I have ever been able to say correctly. You say it correctly all the time, she said. You just do not always use words. He kissed her in the dark on the porch of their house on their land. And inside, their 3 children were sleeping, and the school was standing in the valley 2 miles down the creek path, and the cattle were settled in the summer grass, and the cottonwoods were dark shapes against the stars, and the whole of the life they had built together was right here in the warm Kansas night, solid and real and entirely their own, belonging to no one else and owed to no one, free and clear. Built from the ground up by 2 people who had found each other at the exact right moment and had not wasted it. The land remained. The family grew. The school kept its doors open year after year, and the children who learned to read in that bright windowed room carried something out with them into their own lives, a gift that multiplied in ways that Kate could not track and did not need to, because the giving of it was its own complete thing. She taught until Thomas was old enough to take over the farm's accounts, and Eleanor was old enough to break her own horses, and Samuel was old enough to have strong opinions about cattle management that were, Oscar admitted privately to Kate, generally correct. There were hard years and easy years, dry summers and wet ones, years when the market was good and years when they tightened carefully and made do. There were nights when the wind came down from the north with a cold that got into the bones and mornings when the light came up perfect and golden, and the world looked brand new. There were arguments, because 2 strong people sharing a life have arguments, and resolutions, because 2 honest people who love each other find their way back. There were illnesses, cattle lost, fences broken, seasons that tried their patience. There were also the ordinary magnificent things. A foal born on a spring morning, a student who finally understood fractions and lit up like a lantern, a summer evening when all 5 of them swam in the deep part of the creek and Oscar taught Thomas to float on his back and Kate watched from the bank and thought that the world was, at its best, precisely this. Oscar served his 2 terms on the county committee and stepped back from it when he was satisfied that the road work and water infrastructure were on a proper footing, and handed off to a younger man from a farm to the north, who had the same kind of practical seriousness that Oscar had valued in the position. He spent more time on the farm after that, which suited him, and the cattle operation became what he had planned it to be, steady and profitable, and built on relationships and reputation rather than luck. Edwin Croft retired from his practice in Wichita in the early 1890s, and sent a long letter to Kate and Oscar about his plans to travel to see the Pacific coast, which he had always wanted to see, and asking after the children by name because he had been following the letters for years with a genuine interest that touched them both. Kate wrote back a 12-page letter about everyone and everything, and Oscar added a page at the end that said simply that they were well, and that whatever part Croft had played in giving Kate back her freedom had consequences that neither of them would ever be able to adequately thank him for. Croft replied that watching an honest thing land well was its own reward, and that the Pacific coast was extraordinary, and that he intended to be back in Kansas for Christmas if they were willing to have him. They were, and he came, and sat at their table with the family and Clara and Amos, and was treated with the particular warmth reserved for people who have done something real for you, and have never made you feel the debt of it. The last snow of the winter of 1894 fell on a Sunday in early March, a light, gentle snow that came down in the quiet of the morning and lay on everything in clean white silence. And Kate stood at the window with her coffee and watched it come down and thought about nothing specific and everything in general, which is the best state of mind available to a person whose life is in good order. Oscar came and stood beside her and looked out at the snow, and the farm was white and still and perfect in the early light, and the barn was dark against it, and the cottonwoods stood bare and silver in the west, and somewhere beyond the snow the creek was moving. "It is beautiful," Kate said. "It is," he agreed. Thomas appeared in the kitchen behind them, already dressed and wanting breakfast with the enthusiasm of a 15-year-old who has things to do, and Alina was not far behind, her red and dark braids undone and her boots already on because she had apparently decided to go out before anything else was settled. And Samuel came last, moving with the unhurried certainty of a 5-year-old who knows that the world will wait for him. The house filled with sound and warmth and the smell of coffee and the particular beautiful noise of a family morning, and Kate and Oscar stood at the window a moment longer before turning into it, into all of it, the breakfast and the children and the day and the life that was entirely, completely, stubbornly, joyfully theirs. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.